Welcome to the debate. In Formula One, spending an extra dollar or running an engine for 1 extra hour on the dyno, that used to be the ultimate reward for winning. It was the prize you earned for getting the engineering right.
Right, it was pure merit.
Exactly. But as we barrel toward the radical 2026 engine regulations, the sport is essentially rewriting its own financial constitution to do the exact opposite. They are preparing to hand millions of dollars to the manufacturer that is currently failing the hardest.
And let's not beat around the bush. That manufacturer is Honda. I mean, they are currently staring down just an absolutely catastrophic entry into the 2026 era with Aston Martin.
Yeah, it's not looking good.
It's a nightmare. We are talking about severe vibrations literally tearing power units apart on the test benches, massive aerodynamic packaging issues, and, fundamentally, an internal power deficit of roughly 70 horsepower.
Which is massive.
It's a tractor. So, what does the FIA do? Instead of letting them suffer the consequences of just, bad engineering, they are deploying the ADO, the Additional Development and Upgrade Opportunities Framework, to essentially bail them out.
Which, look, I get it, that sounds entirely backwards if you were a motorsport purist, but handing Honda a potential $19 million lifeline feels wrong right up until you realize the alternative.
You mean them rage quitting the sport again?
Well, yes. If we don't implement this safety net, Honda likely walks. And if a titan like Honda walks right at the dawn of the new regulations, the 2026 grid and the commercial ecosystem of the sport itself is at risk of a major collapse.
But you are letting a manufacturer hold the FIA hostage simply because they mismanaged their own R&D. I mean, writing sporting regulations with a gun to your head is a terrible foundation for meritocracy.
Is it extortion, though, or is it just reality?
It's extortion. You're effectively punishing the teams like Mercedes and Ferrari that actually nailed the regulations by subsidizing the one that failed. F1 is supposed to be brutal.
I don't see it as a subsidy, though. I see it as systemic pragmatism. F1 does not exist in a vacuum, right? We have to look at the reality outside of the F1 paddock.
You mean the corporate boardroom in Tokyo?
Exactly. Right now, Honda is enduring a historic global financial crisis on the corporate side. We know they just posted a net annual loss of 423.9 billion yen. That is roughly $2.7 billion.
Ouch. Yeah, that's a lot of red ink.
Right? They're struggling with their EV strategies, they're canceling global road car projects, and their board is looking for absolutely anywhere to trim the fat.
Which makes an underperforming, incredibly expensive F1 team a massive target on the spreadsheet.
Exactly. F1 is a marketing exercise for these automotive giants. Given Honda's extreme corporate vulnerability right now, a disastrous F1 engine program where they are lapped twice every Sunday by Mercedes isn't just embarrassing.
It's a PR disaster.
It triggers an immediate board-level decision to exit the sport completely. The FIA expanding the ADO rules to allow an extra $11 million in cost cap allowances, plus up to 230 extra dyno test bench hours for a manufacturer that falls more than 10% behind, that is the only way to stop that bleeding.
But
look, F1 needs global automotive giants more than those giants need F1.
see, the math on the dyno hours and the financial panic might add up for the accountants, but the sporting mechanics of this are a massive loophole. You just said it yourself. F1 needs global automotive giants.
It's the truth.
That is a pure too big to fail mentality. F1 is treating Honda like a central bank treats a collapsing financial institution. But this is supposed to be the pinnacle of motorsport engineering.
It still is.
Is it? If they are 70 horsepower down, they need to engineer their way out of it within the confines of the cost cap, not beg the FIA for an extra $19 million and 230 hours of free dyno time.
But wait. Engineering your way out of it within the current rigid cost cap is a mathematical impossibility.
How?
Because the days of unlimited resources where you could run an engine on a dyno 24/7 until it stopped exploding, those days are dead. We have a strict cost cap now.
Which is a good thing.
It is. But if we enforce a completely rigid cost cap without a robust catch-up mechanism, aren't we just guaranteeing a monopoly? I mean, we lived through 2014.
the start of the turbo hybrid era.
Exactly. We saw what happens when one manufacturer perfects the engine and the rules prevent anyone else from spending the money to catch up. The leading team dominates for a decade. We cannot have a repeat of that in 2026.
Look, I understand the fear of a 2014-style monopoly. Nobody wants to see one car win 20 races a year. But the ADA was originally designed as a basic safety net, right? Just to keep teams from being dangerously uncompetitive.
Right.
It was never intended to be a catapult to put an underperforming team straight back into title contention.
Let's actually unpack what 230 extra dyno hours means, because it is absurd.
Let's do it, because I argue it's purely about survival, not dominance.
Well, the sliding scale for 8.0 is cumulative, right? If you're 2 to 4% behind the benchmark power output, you get 70 extra hours. It scales up to an extra 190 hours if you're 8% off.
Right.
Now, lifting that ceiling to 230 extra hours for a 10% deficit, I mean, that is a massive amount of physical time.
It is, but they desperately needed to fix the severe vibration issues we talked about. Wait, explain why that specific amount of time is critical for vibrations. Because to the average listener, 230 hours just sounds like they get to leave the lights on in the factory a little longer. It doesn't sound that extreme.
Oh, it's extreme. It's about harmonic resonance and destructive testing. You don't just run an engine on a test bench to see if it makes power, right?
Right, it's not just a quick pull for a horsepower number.
Exactly. You have to run the internal combustion engine, the ICE, and the transmission together on a full powertrain dyno.
Specifically at sustained high speeds.
Yes, exceeding 7,500 RPM. And when an engine has a fundamental vibration flaw, which we know this one does, those high-frequency harmonics literally shake the gearbox to pieces.
It essentially acts like a jackhammer.
Exactly. And to fix it, you have to run the engine until it breaks, analyze the telemetry, redesign the block or the mounts, machine new parts, and test it all over again.
And that takes forever.
That cycle of destructive testing eats dozens of hours per iteration. Without those 230 hours, Honda mathematically cannot complete enough redesign cycles before the 2026 season starts. Their engine would be illegal or just, explode on lap 3.
Okay, look, the engineering logic behind the dyno hours makes sense for reliability. I will concede that you need time to stop an engine from destroying itself. But let's move to the financial side of this, because this is where I heavily scrutinize the bailout.
You mean the loan?
Yes. The ADO expansion isn't just about time, it's about cash. Specifically, the $8 million performance-based cost relief loan. This is the most egregious part of the entire package.
Really? You think the loan is worse than the 230 hours of dyno time?
Without question. The FIA is allowing Honda to borrow $8 million against its own future spending cap.
Right.
Letting a team front-load their development spending completely breaks the fundamental rhythm of the cost cap era. Let me use an analogy. It is like taking out a massive mortgage today to buy the best aerodynamic and powertrain integration baseline possible, rather than building it brick by brick over 3 years like everyone else has to do.
But they pay it back.
But in Formula One, time is lap time. Baseline data gathered early pays compound interest.
Compound interest, how so? Break that down.
Okay, if you spend that $8 million today to solve your packaging issues, you establish a stable platform, right?
Sure.
So every single aerodynamic upgrade you bring for the next 3 years works better because the foundational airflow around the engine is already sorted. You are buying your way out of a deficit and securing lap time compound interest for the entire regulatory cycle.
I hear that, and the aero baseline is critical. But you are omitting the fact that this loan is not free money. The repayment structure the FIA instituted is incredibly strict.
Okay, come on. How strict can it be when the team is threatening to quit?
Strict in practice, not just on paper. 100% of that $8 million relief must be repaid over the 3 subsequent seasons.
Okay.
And the rules mandate that each of those 3 years must include a repayment between 20 and 50% of the total amount. You cannot take the $8 million now, pay back 1% next year, and defer the remaining 99% indefinitely.
So they are locked into a payment plan.
Exactly. It forces Honda to make a massive long-term strategic sacrifice, having significantly less money to spend in 2027 and 2028, just in order to survive this short-term crisis in 2026. It prevents them from exploiting the loan as a pure performance boost.
But wait, that entire argument, that strict repayment schedule, it relies on one massive, glaring assumption, that Honda is actually going to stick around to pay it back.
Well, they are contracted to partner with Aston Martin.
Contracts in F1 are just paper if a corporate board in Tokyo decides the marketing ROI is negative. Why should the sport bend its foundational financial rules and offer an uncollateralized sporting loan to an institution that continually abandons ship the absolute second the PR gets difficult?
They don't continually abandon ship.
Let's look at their track record. They quit in 2008, right before their infrastructure birthed the dominant Braun GP.
Look, that was a completely different era, a different global financial crisis.
Fine. What about 2015? They returned with McLaren, and we all remember that calamitous run.
It was rough.
Rough? It was years of humiliation, complete integration failures, Fernando Alonso screaming GP2 engine on the radio. It was a disaster. Then, miraculously, they get it right. They partner with Red Bull, they finally build a dominant internal combustion engine, and what do?
They left.
They officially withdraw in 2021. They sold their intellectual property, forced Red Bull to spend hundreds of millions building Red Bull powertrains, and then slowly crept back in through commercial sponsor agreements once they realized they built a championship winner. They are institutional flakes.
Okay, I'm not defending their past volatility. The 2021 exit was baffling, I agree.
Thank you.
But your argument ignores why Honda is returning as a full works partner for 2026. The 2026 regulations are a radical shift. We are moving to a 50-50 power split between the internal combustion engine and the electrical systems, all running on 100% sustainable fuels.
Yeah.
That specific technological profile matches Honda's global corporate roadmap perfectly. They are here for the tech transfer.
Right. But they are currently failing at building that exact profile.
Which is exactly why the stakes are so high right now. The cost of failure for Honda right now isn't just a bad Sunday in Monaco. It's the invalidation of their entire global R&D department. The FIA isn't bailing them out of pity.
Then why?
They are doing it because if the sport wants to remain technologically relevant to these global titans, it has to provide the framework for them to succeed in these exact, highly complex technologies.
But the complexity is exactly why a 70-horsepower deficit in the ICE is an absolute death sentence in 2026. And it's why this bailout might not even work. I mean, for the audience who might not have memorized the 2026 rulebook, let's break down why losing internal combustion power is so catastrophic under these new rules.
Okay, it's all about the harvesting loop.
Exactly. In 2026, the FIA is entirely dropping the MGU-H, the motor generator unit heat.
Right, which currently harvests energy from the exhaust gases.
Exactly. So the entire electrical recovery burden shifts to the MGU-K, the kinetic harvester under braking.
Right, so it's a 50-50 split. The ICE produces roughly 400 kilowatts, and the electrical system produces roughly 350 kilowatts.
Yes, but they are intrinsically linked, and this is the key. If Honda's ICE is down 70 horsepower, the car arrives at the end of the straight at a lower top speed.
Make sense?
Because the car arrives at a lower speed, there's less kinetic energy for the MGU-K to harvest under braking.
Ah, right.
And because you harvested less energy, you have a less electrical deployment for the next straight. The deficit literally compounds lap after lap. It is a death spiral.
It is brutal.
That is exactly why they shouldn't be bailed out. If you mess up the fundamental architecture of a 2026 engine, it should compound. That's the punishment for poor engineering.
But, if they're trapped in that death spiral, unable to fix it because the cost cap restricts their dyno time, they leave. Aston Martin is left without a works deal, the grid loses a major manufacturer, and the health of the entire sport degrades. That is why the rival teams agreed to this.
Wait, did they agree or were they pressured?
No, they agreed. Mercedes, Ferrari, Audi, Renault, they all signed off on this ADO extension because they recognized the systemic risk of losing Honda. They looked at the data and agreed to the threshold. If a team is more than 10% behind, they get the relief.
And here we arrive at the absolute crux of the problem, the aha moment where this entire regulatory house of cards collapses.
Okay, let's hear it.
How does the FIA actually calculate a 10% deficit?
Well, they use telemetry. The rules dictate they analyze torque sensors on the drive shaft, electrical deployment logs, and fuel mass flow meters. They aren't just guessing, they have the raw data of what the engine is outputting.
Raw data in Formula One is never just raw data. You cannot separate the internal combustion engine's performance from the aerodynamic compromises demanded by the chassis team. Let's say Aston Martin's aero department decides they want incredibly aggressive, shrink-wrap side pods to reduce drag.
Which, every team wants.
Right. But smaller side pods mean smaller radiators. Smaller radiators mean less airflow and less cooling. So the Honda engine starts running dangerously hot on the track.
Right.
To prevent the engine block from melting or detonating, the Honda engineers have to intervene. They electronically retard the ignition timing, or they run a richer fuel mix, which fundamentally sacrifices horsepower to save the engine.
So the telemetry shows a drop in power.
Exactly. On the FIA's telemetry screens, it looks like the Honda engine is down 10% on power. But it's not an engine deficit. It's an aerodynamic cooling deficit disguised as a power issue.
That's a phenomenal point.
Thank you. How is the FIA supposed to isolate the internal combustion engine's purely mechanical deficit from the aerodynamic compromises forced upon it by Aston Martin?
The integration between chassis and power unit is tighter than ever, absolutely. But the FIA isn't just looking at race weekend data where the aero affects cooling. They are looking at the factory dyno data, where the engine runs in a controlled environment without the chassis.
But even on the dyno, you have variables. Turbo size, exhaust back pressure dictated by the specific pipe routing Aston Martin requires just to clear their suspension geometry. The point is, calculating a precise 2% or exactly a 10% deficit is highly subjective.
It's complex, sure.
And when the entire grid knows the FIA is terrified of Honda leaving the sport, do you honestly trust the FIA not to look at a 9.2% deficit and magically round up to 10% just to unlock that $19 million bailout?
I do trust them, honestly, because the other manufacturers will be auditing that process like hawks.
You think so?
Absolutely. Mercedes and Ferrari might have agreed to the ADO's safety net in principle to keep the grid healthy, but they are not going to let the FIA hand Honda $19 million and 230 dyno hours unless the math is bulletproof. The rival team principals will demand complete transparency on how that performance index is calculated.
I think you are giving the regulatory body far too much credit. This leaves massive room for subjective regulatory bias. If Honda shows up to a test, and they have to run the engine in a lower power mode simply to survive 300 kilometers without vibrating the gearbox to pieces, the FIA has to make a judgment call. Is that a fundamental power deficit deserving of a bailout, or is that just a team choosing a conservative reliability mode?
But it's both. If you can't run your engine at full power because it will explode, you have a power deficit.
No, you have a poorly designed engine, and subsidizing it is wrong. Have you considered what happens if Honda takes this $8 million loan, utilizes the $11 million cost cap allowance, burns through the 230 extra dyno hours, front-loads all their development for 2026, and still produces an absolute tractor of an engine?
Then the project probably dies and the ADO is proven ineffective. But what happens when this rescue package isn't enough? Do we bend the rules again? Do we give them $30 million? 500 dyno hours? My core position remains. While keeping Honda on the grid is obviously desirable for the health of the sport, twisting the financial rules to compensate for corporate mismanagement and engineering failure, it threatens the core integrity of Formula One.
The integrity of the cost cap, you mean?
Exactly. You cannot claim to have a legitimate cost cap if you constantly write multi-million-dollar loopholes for the teams that fail to adhere to the performance standards. F1 is supposed to be brutal.
It is brutal, but look, it's also a multi-billion-dollar entertainment product. There is an inherent friction here between maintaining a pure, unflinching sporting meritocracy and engineering a stable commercial ecosystem.
Right.
If F1 is just an engineering purity test, then fine. Let Honda fail. Let Aston Martin collapse down the grid, and let Mercedes win by 2 laps every weekend. But nobody wants to watch that.
I'd rather watch authentic dominance than artificial parity bought with an FIA credit card.
Well, we are going to find out very soon if this credit card has a limit. The FIA has actually moved the first ADO performance check forward.
Oh, really?
Yeah, originally they were going to assess these engine deficits later in the season around Monaco or Miami. Now they've pushed it to the Canadian Grand Prix.
Well, that accelerated timeline absolutely proves the sheer corporate panic behind the scenes. They need to know immediately if Honda triggers the 10% threshold so they can start deploying those dyno hours.
Because Canada is a high-speed track, it's incredibly power-sensitive. It is going to be a profound watershed moment for the sport. It will be the first true test of the FIA's technical capability in this new era.
It will be trial by fire.
We are going to see exactly how accurately they can measure these engine performance deficits amidst all those incredibly complex variables you brought up, the exhaust dynamics, the aero integration, the thermal trade-offs.
And it will set the precedent for the entire 2026 regulatory cycle. I mean, if the FIA handles the data transparently and can mathematically prove that Honda's engine in isolation from the Aston Martin chassis is genuinely 10% behind, then maybe, just maybe, the ADO system is validated as a necessary evil.
But if they don't,
and the math looks fuzzy, it will go down as a multi-million-dollar handout engineered purely out of fear, a complete betrayal of the cost cap.
I mean, it all comes back to how we view the rulebook. We want the load-bearing calculations of the cost cap to be rigid. We want it to be a pure meritocracy.
We do.
But sometimes, when you see a vital pillar of the sport starting to crack under pressure, the most practical solution isn't to let it fall just to prove a point about gravity. Sometimes you have to rush in and reinforce the structure, even if it means rewriting the blueprints on the fly and handing out a loan you aren't sure will ever be paid back.
The question is whether that reinforcement actually fixes the foundation or just delays an inevitable collapse.
Exactly. We'll leave it to our listeners to decide if Honda's $19 million lifeline is the pragmatism Formula One needs to survive 2026 or an anti-competitive loophole that destroys the merit of the sport. There's so much more to explore as we get closer to the Canadian Grand Prix assessment. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.